Although you may think that your positive ball lift is operating correctly, the adjustment may be far from perfect, in spite of the ball appearing to return reliably. A few seconds lost in each game can, by the end of the week, result in a significant loss of revenue. A simple series of adjustments, carried out in the correct order, can ensure reliable, speedy and trouble-free operation of your ball elevator.
Whenever you work on a bowling machine, the first consideration must be safety. Remove the Russell stole plugs from both machines, then, for further protection, make sure that all of the switches on both machines are in the off position. Only then, remove the guard. Firstly, check that the unit has been correctly installed, with the correct dimensions observed in the positioning of the sensor between the side plates. A rule can be used to check this. Also check that the pivot is perpendicular. You can then check that the correct amount of washers have been fitted below the cam follower, positioning it low enough to slide under the rudder cams when the paddle movement is blocked, yet high enough to allow the rudder cam to lock behind it when set to give extra pressure on power drive. Having made sure that the sensor unit is correctly installed and operating in a satisfactory manner, you can then adjust the pivot crank and rod to obtain optimum paddle position and travel. It is important to understand the function of the pivot crank and rod assemblies and how their adjustment affects the positioning of the paddle. Start by removing the end of the rod assembly from the crank pin. Remove the drive belt from the sheave and take off both reset cams. In order to remove the cams, you must take off the two 5/16 UNC bolts, fastening the cams to the support plate. And this is done to ensure that they do not interfere with the movement of the paddle and sensor assembly when the pivot crank and rod are being adjusted. You will notice on removing the cams that they are slotted to facilitate adjustment at a later stage. The paddle arm and sensor unit should now be free to move from left to right between the side plate stops. Next, slacken the lock nut on the rod assembly. If the rod is shortened, the paddle will move more to the left. If lengthened, more to the right. Slacken off the crank plate adjusting nuts. One end of the plate is slotted, allowing you to move the pin towards the center of the sheave, thus restricting paddle travel to the minimum. Fit the rod back onto the crank plate and check for central operation of the rudder arm. In this case, it is too far to the left. So the rod has to be lengthened. Replace the rod and recheck. You should now have central operation of the rudder arm between the side plates. It is now necessary to readjust the crank plate along the slot until the rudder arm just touches the stops on either side. With all nuts tightened, make one final check to ensure that the rudder operates centrally and just touches the stops. The next stage is to set the trip cam to operate the follower when the paddle meets an obstruction. With the cam followers pushed forward to their maximum position, adjust the trip cams to give 1/8 clearance on each side between the trip cam and rollers. A suitable gauge can be made from a piece of 1/8 material. When you are satisfied with the adjustments, tighten the bolts and check the clearance again. It is important to have this gap to ensure that power drive is not engaged by the slight movement caused when the paddle touches the stops. You are now ready to replace your reset cams. The fixing bolts should be tightened slightly so as to still allow movement of the cams. Initially, set them as close to the adjacent side plates as possible. Then, carefully moved inwards along the slots until they just reset the rollers forwards to the normal drive position. Move both cam followers to the rear. Then, manually rotate the drive pulley. As each follower strikes the reset cam, it should be returned to its forward position. The roller should still be free to rotate, having allowed the rudder cams to flick back up into the raised position, clearing the paddle drive cam follower. To check that the adjustments have been successful, insert a broom handle or something similar into the paddle tube. When resistance in excess of that caused by a pin in the ball door is applied, the trip cam should lock into the power drive position, and a definite increase in pressure to the left or right should be evident. When you stop applying the resistance, the reset cams should then return the paddle to the normal pressure, sufficient only to discourage pins from entering the ball door. Having completed the paddle and sensor adjustments, It is equally important that the ball lift arm and elevator belt are correctly adjusted. Firstly, place a ball into the ball exit and adjust the rubber bumpers on the side plate to give a 1/4 inch clearance between the ball and the belt. The clearance is increased by adjusting the bumper up and decreased by adjusting it down. Make sure that the lock nut is tightened after adjustment. Again, a simple gauge can be made to check the clearance between ball and belt. It is very important that the lift belt assembly is centred exactly between the return rails. If it is not, it is possible that as the ball travels up the rail, it will force the belt off its pulley. Also check that you have 4.5 to 5.5 inches between belt and return rail, and that the tension spring measures 4 to 4.5 inches. The final adjustment concerns the lift arm that gives the system its name. This is connected by a rod to the ratchet drive assembly. The length of the rod is a critical feature of the system's operation and should be initially set at 15.5 inches from the centre to centre of the rod ends. This positions the lift arm 1/8 to 3/16 above the door weldment. Minor adjustments to the rod may be necessary to achieve this. If the arm is set too high, there is a danger of marking the ball as it enters the lift. If it is too low, there is a possibility that the ratchet arm will not engage to lift the ball into contact with the elevator belt. Recheck the height of the lift arm. Then get someone to bowl a few balls down on both lanes to check the operation of the system. Little maintenance is normally needed with this system, other than the regular checks of the adjustments, cleaning and some lubrication. But care must be taken, as some parts of the sensor mechanism must not be lubricated, otherwise the power drive cams cannot hold their position. Observing these simple rules will ensure many years of trouble-free operation from your positive ball lift.